The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Elizabeth Lower-Basch of the Center for Law and Social Policy explains why work requirements don't work for people receiving federal assistance. Author Sam Pizzigati makes a case for a maximum wage, and Bill Press talks with Ben Wikler of MoveOn.org about the grassroots movement to elect progressive Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Despite a recent decision in Kentucky to block work requirements for Medicaid patients, the Trump administration is intent in pursuing the policy. Elizabeth Lower-Basch has a long history inside and outside of government figuring out the best ways to assist struggling families. In this encore interview, she says that work requirements for people on public assistance is exactly not the way to help. And we say hello to Elizabeth Lower-Basch, who's director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you so much for having me to talk about this important topic.
Absolutely, and it is our pleasure. You know, with his sights on overhauling the nation's safety net, President Trump has opened the door to new orders that put in place work requirements for people receiving various kinds of federal assistance. First, explain to us what exactly is a work requirement.
Sure. So the basic idea behind the work requirement is that if someone who's receiving some sort of basic need assistance, so that could be cash or food or health care or housing, doesn't work a minimum number of hours or participate in another required activity and doesn't prove that they're working those hours, they can be cut off from receiving those benefits. And in some cases, their family can lose the benefits as well.
Wow. How many of these work requirements have actually been put in place so far? And what kind of benefits are we talking about that are at risk?
So cash assistance under temporary assistance for needy families, which is known by the really awful acronym of TANF, has had work requirements since it was created in 1996. SNAP, or food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is the full official title these days, has work requirements for some populations and has had for decades. But the president and the House Republicans are proposing to expand those requirements to almost everyone who gets food stamps. And they are also approving waiver requests from states that want to impose work requirements as a condition of getting health care under the Medicaid program. And finally, most recently, we're hearing proposals to apply work requirements in housing programs. So it's really showing up all over the place.
I was going to say, I mean, that's covering a huge amount of that population that needs this assistance. In understanding what doesn't work with work requirements, let's start with some of the core assumptions. What are the stereotypes embedded in these programs?
Well, the first stereotype behind the work requirements is that people who are participating in these programs are not currently working. And certainly for both SNAP and Medicaid, a large share of the working age population in these programs are working. And it's just that they are in jobs that either don't provide health insurance or don't pay enough for them to feed their families. So that's the first big stereotype. The second big stereotype is that people don't want to work, that if they're not working, that they need to be forced to work. Whereas the reality is that overwhelmingly people do want to work, but are struggling with other things that are preventing them from doing so.
We're speaking with Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy here today on americasdemocrats.org. Elizabeth, we already have data that shows the impact of mandatory work programs. First of all, what type of effect do we see on employment and earnings?
So the basic answer is we see very little effect on earnings and really on employment either. People are often able to find low-wage jobs on their own, and that's really what happens when they participate in these programs. Some people find jobs, but most of them would have been able to find jobs even if they hadn't had these requirements. The reality of low-wage work is that people move in and out of jobs, and when they're out of work is when they're most likely to apply for help. And so even if you did absolutely nothing, you would see more people moving into the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Who are the people most affected by these requirements?
Well, it's really pretty much everyone. People who are quite likely to not be able to comply with the requirements include people who might have a work limitation, a disability, but that doesn't qualify them for disability benefits. All the programs sort of say, oh, well, we're only going to apply this to people who are able to work, but we know from TANF and SNAP, which have had work requirements, that many people with disabilities do lose benefits. Also, people who can't find work for other reasons. We know people who are returning citizens who have been, previous histories of incarceration often find it incredibly difficult to find jobs. People don't want to take a chance on them, and this would just be another blow, keeping them out of getting benefits. And finally, we know that people who are working are going to lose benefits from these requirements because they won't be able to keep up with the paperwork to track their hours.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's amazing to me is you have so many people that are working multiple jobs, but because they have perhaps no education or for whatever reason, they're very low level paying jobs. They've got two jobs. They still can't afford to support their family, and they're affected by this. And something's wrong with a system like that. You know, you argue that work requirements show a profound misunderstanding of the realities of low-wage jobs. Can you expand on that for us, please?
Sure. It's just what we were saying, that, people are often patching together multiple jobs. There's a lot of unpredictable scheduling where you might not know until Sunday night which days you're going to be working. And if you don't keep your schedule free for those hours of work, you might not get any hours scheduled. So the idea that someone can just say, oh, well, I'm only working 15 hours this week, I'll just go to my boss and tell them I need to have 20 hours every week is just unfortunately not the way the labor market works.
And we're in a gig economy, so there are only going to be more people that are affected in that regard, where you don't know when your next day of work is coming.
Right, and sort of the whole paperwork we're thinking about how if you're self-employed and maybe you're starting off and you're not turning a profit yet, and whether people will get credit for that. And it's crazy because each of these programs has different rules, is the way they're setting it up. So someone might have 4 different sets of requirements for 4 different programs.
Mm-hmm. And again, we're speaking with Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy. Elizabeth, your research shows that even when some people are meeting their work requirements, they still lose benefits. How does that happen? And what does it tell us about work requirements being enforced?
Right. So this is what I was saying about the paperwork, that many of these proposals suggest that people would have to report their hours of work every month. I know at least one state says you'd have to do it online. So if you live in a place where you don't have access to high-speed internet or you don't have a computer at home, you might be out of luck having to do, another trip to some place where you couldn't get online to report your hours. And the reality is people's lives are busy, and sometimes they might not submit the paperwork on time. Other times even they do submit the paperwork on time and the caseworker doesn't get to it, or it gets lost in the mail. And we know there's a lot of churning that's created, and that's stressful for the clients, and it also uses up caseworkers' time. There's one study from Minnesota that found that under TANF programs, the caseworkers were literally spending half their time just tracking down hours of participation and not doing any work with the clients that might help them get a better job.
And as you acknowledged earlier, most people who receive public benefits, they do want to work. What would a program look like that actually helped them achieve that goal?
Right. So there's, I think, two pieces of it. One is sometimes what you really need is job creation and subsidized employment programs. Those have gotten a lot more attention at the national scale in the last year than they've been recently discussed. But we actually have an example from something that was called the TANF Emergency Fund that was created as part of the Recovery Act in 2010. And 39 states used some of the funds under that to create subsidized employment programs for people who really wanted to work and couldn't find jobs. And these are states with Democratic governors, states with Republican governors. It was wildly popular. So that's one real opportunity. And then the other piece is education and training. And as you said, the best predictor of employment is having credentials and skills that are valued in the labor force. And so programs that actually help people get those skills and credentials can make a real difference.
Except there's not enough, it seems to me anyway, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there just doesn't seem to be enough emphasis on those couple of things that you just mentioned. And I don't understand why we keep tearing away at education when we all know that a better education is exactly what you need to survive.
Right, and that's one of the things that's been incredibly frustrating, as I said, under TANF, cash assistance, which has had work requirements for 20 years, is that people don't really get credit for that, for going to college on an ongoing basis. That they have to somehow struggle to combine parenting and going to school and working in order to keep getting the tiny amount of cash that they can get under TANF. So it's really counterproductive to long-term self-security.
Just amazing. Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Elizabeth, we do appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, a bold response to the widening gap between rich and poor in America. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Shame is that queasy feeling you get when you realize you've done something improper, ridiculous, or just flat-out contemptible. But it's socially invaluable, for feeling ashamed is a built-in jerk alarm, keeping most of us from doing the same embarrassing thing again. But what if you're not embarrassed by being a jerk? Sure enough, some individuals who rise to high places are so consumed by self-importance, self-righteousness, self-aggrandizement, and all things selfish that they feel no shame, even when their narcissism does gross harm to others. One example is the clique of prominent polluters, politicos, and propagandists who are climate change deniers. They shamefully use their prominence to enhance their own fame and fortune. While glaciers melt, oceans rise, extreme weather expands, species perish, and Earth itself spins toward being unlivable. Unable to acknowledge shame, they need help. Luckily, a feisty group called Cowboys for Liberty has stepped forward to acknowledge it for them by establishing a Climate Deniers Hall of Shame. Among the first class of infamous deniers are Charles and David Koch, who've dumped more than $100 million into front groups opposing efforts to halt climate change. Senator Jim Inhofe, the dotty old dean of deniers, who has called global warming a conspiracy spawned by the Weather Channel. And the former CEO of ExxonMobil, who secretly funded hooked-up academic reports to discredit the science of climate change. This is Jim Hightower saying, the Hall of Shame is fun, but it's not a prank. It points out that climate change is not only caused by human action, but also by human inaction. And putting names and faces to the small group of humans selfishly preventing progress can help the majority of us see that we can and must rise up to stop them. To help, go to whydeny.org. whydeny.org.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Income inequality in America is now at a rate we haven't seen in close to 100 years. In a new book, author Sam Pizzigati says it's time to resurrect an idea once endorsed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a maximum wage for our nation's highest earners. And we say hello to Sam Pizzigati, who co-edits inequality.org for the Institute for Policy Studies. His newest book is The Case for a Maximum Wage. Sam Pizzigati, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
And thank you for having me.
Well, certainly our pleasure to have you with us. Sam, what is a maximum wage and how would it actually work?
Well, we all understand the concept of a minimum wage. We understand that a society without a minimum wage, without a floor under earnings, is inviting meanness and exploitation. Well, societies without an adequate maximum wage, without a ceiling on earnings, invite exploitation and meanness too. When we allow our most powerful to keep as much as they can grab, we create, with these sort of outrageous rewards, we create an incentive for outrageous behavior. We have CEOs, for instance, who will do whatever it takes to grab the CEO pay brass ring. They'll downsize, they'll outsource, they'll cut worker pensions, they'll cheat and shortchange consumers, they'll wreak social havoc. So I think with this as the reality that's facing us, lots of people are talking about the idea of capping income. So how could a maximum wage work? Well, historically, advocates for a maximum wage have talked about a 100% tax rate on income over a certain point. So back in 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress for a 100% tax rate on income over $25,000. Now, income over $25,000 in 1942 would equal about almost $400,000 today. Now, Congress didn't give FDR that 100% maximum wage tax rate, but they did give members of Congress did give FDR a a 94% top tax rate. And over the next 20 years in the United States, our top tax rate hovered around that 90%. And we saw the emergence in those years of the first mass middle class in world history. But that equality couldn't be sustained. And that's why advocates for a maximum wage are now moving in a different direction. They're not concentrating, we're not concentrating just on redistributing wealth, but we're talking about how we're looking at how wealth gets pre-distributed in the first place.
Why is this an important idea for our nation right now?
Well, I think because what we've seen over the past 4 decades now is we've seen incredible growing inequality in the United States, and we've paid a price for that all across the board, with our economy, with our democracy, even with the coarsening of our culture. I think we're realizing that unequal societies, excessively unequal societies, simply don't work very well.
Now, one way of looking at this is a difference between redistributing and pre-distributing wealth. Why is this distinction important, and what has been the failure of redistributing wealth?
Well, redistribution, as traditionally practiced in the United States and around the world, takes as a given the inequality that a modern economy creates, then uses the tax system to clean up that inequality. But the problem is the wealthy always push back hard, really hard, against that cleanup. That the wealthy consider high tax rates on high incomes as a personal affront, and they can see a direct personal benefit from reducing those top rates. Meanwhile, average people see only an indirect benefit from high taxes on high incomes. So you have a basic political asymmetry here. The rich are battling much more intensely because they see a vested personal interest in the struggle. They're battling much more intensely to cut top tax rates than everybody else is battling to keep them high. So you had a situation in the closing decades of the 20th century where the rich kept pounding at those high tax rates year after year until they finally prevailed and cut them. And so our top tax rate would drop from 91% as late as 1964 to 37% today. And actually, after loopholes, that top tax rate is closer to 20%. So what lesson have egalitarians learned from all this? We've learned that we need to start thinking about preventing excessive income inequality before it gets locked in. We need to prevent our most powerful from grabbing an outsized share of the wealth our economy creates. And we can do that. We can begin to do that if we focus on capping the pay gap between top corporate executives and their workers. In the middle of the 20th century, our most powerful CEOs were averaging about 30 times what their workers make. Today, they routinely make over 300 times what their most typical workers are making.
Wow. We're speaking with Sam Pizzigati, who co-edits inequality.org for the Institute for Policy Studies, and his newest book is The Case for a Maximum Wage. Sam, you've been thinking and talking about this idea for over 2 decades. You've noted it wasn't taken very seriously when you started. How have attitudes changed since then?
Well, they've changed substantially. Back in the early 1990s, when I first started researching and writing about this, it was hard to find any serious political figure anywhere in the world who was talking about the idea of a maximum wage, talking about the idea of capping income. Now you do. You can find serious people. So, for instance, in France, in the last French presidential election last year, in the first round of that presidential voting, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was the candidate of the most progressive party on the ballot, his platform called for a maximum wage in France, and he came within 4 percentage points of winning that first round election. In the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, who is the head of the leader of the British Labour Party, last year started talking about the idea of a maximum wage in Great Britain. And right here in the United States, Congressman Keith Ellison from Minnesota, who is the deputy chair of the Democratic National Committee, so a fairly important person politically in the United States. Keith Ellison, speaking this past March before the annual retreat of Congressional Progressive Caucus, called for a maximum wage. So you see in top progressive leadership around the world, you see an interest in this idea of capping income, and public attitudes are changing too. We've seen 3 polls just this spring. In South Africa, there was a question that pollsters asked, a business group asked in a poll about the idea of a maximum wage for corporate executives, and people in the South African public supported that idea by 3-to-1 margin. In Australia, last month, in May rather, there was a poll along a similar line, and 75% of Australians said they support the idea of a maximum wage for corporate executives. And here in the United States, Gallup just finished a poll that asked a question that Gallup had previously asked in 2012, and that question was, does society benefit from having a class of very rich people? And among Democrats in 2012, over half of Democrats, 52% back then, said yes, the United States benefits from having a class of rich people. This time, a minority of Democrats, only 43%, said the United States benefits from having a class of rich. So I think this among general publics and among progressive leaders, attitudes really are changing.
Do you believe it could really be a politically viable idea in the United States today? I mean, it's hard for us to agree on a minimum wage of $15 an hour. Is there any support in Congress?
Yes, and in Congress and state legislatures, interest in this idea is growing. And one factor that's increasing that interest is that this year, for the first time ever, corporations in the United States must disclose the ratio between their CEO pay and the pay of their most typical, their median workers. So all this spring, you've been seeing all around the United States headlines trumpeting the gaps between CEOs and their actual workers. So we know now that last year at Walmart, the Walmart CEO took home almost 1,200 times the pay of the typical Walmart worker. And at McDonald's, the CEO of McDonald's made over 3,000 times the pay of the most typical McDonald's worker. So numbers like these are really opening lawmakers' eyes. And what we see now is that in a half dozen states, there's legislation pending now that would put consequences in place on wide corporate pay gaps. So some of this legislation says that corporations with pay gaps over 25 or 50 or 100 times to 1 should pay taxes at a higher rate than corporations with more modest ratios. Some of this pending legislation gives preferential treatment in the government contracting process to corporations with low, modest pay ratios, and some of this legislation talks about denying government subsidies for development and other needs, denying these subsidies to corporations with wide pay ratios. And we actually have a victory in this merging new pay ratio era. In Oregon, the city of Portland this year, for the first time ever, is taxing businesses that pay over 100 and 250 times their median workers at a higher tax rate than corporations below these thresholds. So I think interest is beginning to build all around the country over this.
Now, as we know, the United States has one of the highest inequality rates in the world, and the impact goes beyond the daily quality of life for our poorest citizens. Many are concerned about the impact of inequality on our democracy. What's the connection?
Well, I think we can all see an obvious connection, and that obvious connection is the power of big money to distort our political process. So think about billionaires like the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson dropping hundreds of millions into the political process in a single election cycle. The Princeton political scientist Marty Gillen and one of his colleagues from Northwestern University, Benjamin Page, they recently looked at 1,800 policy issues that came before Congress over a recent 20-year period. And they concluded from their research that the average American has virtually no impact on the policy decisions that Congress reaches. So you can see that obvious impact of big money. But I think there's a deeper philosophical problem here. And that is that when we talk about democracy, what's the basic idea of democracy? Well, the basic idea of democracy is that people who share common problems get together and discuss and debate those common problems and come up with a solution. I mean, that when you get down to it is the essence of democracy. But that assumption assumes that people share common problems. But when you have a deeply unequal society with a small number of very rich people, with a huge gap between that small number of rich people and everybody else, as we have now, then you have a society where people do not share common problems. The problems that those super rich people face are fundamentally different from the problems that average people face. And if you have a deeply unequal society, top-heavy society, those rich people have the wealth and power to impose their priorities upon society. So what do you get? You get what we have in the United States today. You get gridlock, political gridlock, except on those issues that the rich care most deeply about. So I think it's no surprise that over the last year, the only significant legislation that has gotten through Congress is legislation that was enacted last December that gives the rich a phenomenal new tax break.
Sam Pizzigati, co-editor of inequality.org for the Institute for Policy Studies, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast and his newest book, The Case for a Maximum Wage. Sam, thank you so much for your time with us today. We certainly appreciate it and look forward to having you back again with us soon. Thank you very much. You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Ben Wikler of MoveOn.org on why progressive ideas are winning elections.
Yes, indeed. Heard this before, huh? Sicking the powers of the federal government on your political enemies. Didn't Richard Nixon do that? Now it's Donald Trump. Hello, everybody, on a Tuesday, July 24. So good to see you today. Thanks for being part of the program, The Bill Press Show, live from our nation's capital, and joining you coast to coast on the radio, on television, and online with Ben Wikler, Washington director of MoveOn.org, here in studio with us. Hello, Ben. Great to see you.
It's great to be here.
Welcome back. These are exciting political times here in the midterms, and the big story that I hear, those front page New York Times story on it this weekend, is that the Democrats are really in trouble because people like you are trying to move the party too far to the left.
or towards the voters, as I would say.
Or they particularly cite Alexandria or Ocasio-Cortez, right, as the threat that facing the Democratic Party. Sitting in that chair where you are a couple of weeks ago, Tom Perez, the chair of the DNC, said she's the future of the Democratic Party.
I think that's closer to it. Yeah, this whole thing it's a farce, and it's essentially cooked up by people who are worried that the Democratic Party will take extremely popular positions that are hard to undo because they're so popular, that threaten the interests of people who write really big checks. That's what it comes down to. If you look at polls about where people are in this country, the so-called moderates, the people in so-called middle, are actually conflicted. Generally, they hold, this or that specific view that might be at odds with the Democratic Party, but they are completely right there on issues like Medicare for all, raising the minimum wage to $15, making sure, everyone who wants a job can get a job. These things are actually extremely popular with tons of Republicans as well as independents and progressives. And they're things that unite people. They just happen to scare the donor class. There's a kind of elite, kind of like billionaire cocktail party group of folks who think that what people want is socially liberal, fiscally conservative. They want to slash Social Security benefits. They want to slash Medicare. They just want to, make sure that you can go to do whatever you want when you're on the vineyard. And that's, I support a certain number of the things that they support. They're part of the overwhelming pro-choice majority in this country. But on economic issues, they're just totally out of step. And they not only are out of step in terms of the actual policies, they also, the way that they conduct politics suggests that they don't actually understand or care about the struggles of working people. And the core of politics is showing people whether you're on their side. So to me, the real question is whether politicians are going to be clear that they're on the side of the voters whose votes they need rather than the donors whose checks they keep trying to wrangle.
Well, I by the way, I have a column, and Peter, we should send this out on The Hill this morning. My column in The Hill newspaper this morning is on this very topic. I was just looking, the headline they put on it, Democrats leaning too far left, ? And of course, my answer is hell no. But so when you look at, we call her AOC because her name is such a tongue twister.
Yeah.
That her victory in New York, first of all, she's not the only one, right? There was this upstate New York race where the DCCC, classic Washington top-down establishment, had said, this person is our candidate in this race, and the progressive in that race knocked the DCCC candidate out. I forget the name.
Yep.
The same thing happened in Nebraska, of all places. DCCC says, no, we anoint this person. Classic, the way the Democratic Party has always operated. Somebody, probably, I'm sure, a good person, but out of touch with what's going on today, right? And the energy.
Yeah.
And progressive activist who'd never run for office before knocked her off. So this is happening all over the country. And so I looked at AOC's in New York where she beat Joe Crowley. What did she campaign on? She campaigned on Medicare for all, sentencing reform, getting rid of private prisons, reforming ICE. I mean, say abolishing ICE, reforming ICE. And I forget, but it wasn't, campaign finance reform.
That's outrageous.
Yeah, I mean,
what kind of outrageous?
She wasn't talking about nationalizing the oil companies or the banks. I mean, it was pretty basic. It's the same platform that Bernie Sanders ran on. Almost.
Yeah, and it's a platform that has just gigantic levels of support.
Yes,
it's a hugely popular platform.
So what do they mean when they say they're taking the party too far to the left?
So there was a study that some political scientists did of party committees and who they support in contested primaries.
Oh, wow!
And it's very interesting. So you would think if you believe them if you take them at face value, if you believe them at their word, what they say is that they endorse moderates in districts where a progressive would lose the general election. That's what they say. But the study looked at what they do in nominating in contested primaries, both in contested districts, purple districts where the Republican could win the general, and in totally safe blue districts. And guess what? The common thread is that they always endorse the moderates, the centrists.
Right.
They just don't want the troublemaking rabble-rousers who actually are willing to stir things up to make change that people want. And that's the through line. So you just can't really take the argument at face value for why they're doing what they're doing. And I also have to say, progressives get, sometimes they're they're a place like Alabama where Doug Jones is about as far left as you're going to get, and the movement rallied to Doug Jones and he won. So it's not like we're crazy, throwing things out.
Exactly.
And by the way, Doug Jones was pro-choice, fighting on civil rights, you know what I mean, and standing up for healthcare, a lot of the same stuff. So it cuts in all directions, fighting for people's health, for their ability to live and make it in this economy, in this world. It's a basic, fundamental, decent, progressive idea, and it wins everywhere.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm glad you made that point because, as a progressive, I recognize that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could not win in every district of the country. But progressives are not saying you've got to have her or someone like her, exactly her with her profit, everywhere. But at the same time, I would argue that there are a lot more places that she could win than the establishment Democrats are ever going to acknowledge. And they are so out of touch. And people like we've seen, there have been 43 state legislative seats that have flipped in the last 18 months under Donald Trump from red, deep red, to blue.
Yep.
In Oklahoma, in Florida, in Wisconsin, in Iowa. I mean, that message does.
And not just in the liberal bastions in these states, in very conservative areas.
Yes.
And this, to me, there's three things. One is, whether your views, your policy positions are things that people want. The second is whether you inspire passion and energy in people to actually get out and do the stuff, whether they believe in you, that they believe you're on their side. And the third is whether you, as a candidate, have hustle, whether you have energy. And remember AOC's tweet, respect the hustle. She tweeted the photo of her shoes with the holes in the bottoms.
Yes.
There's that famous photo of Obama with the holes in his soles. And that, getting out there and fighting the fight makes the difference. And frankly, it's often the people who have the most deeply held beliefs and sincere convictions on the issues who want to work the hardest because it's about something more than themselves. And to me, you don't run from those people. You embrace people who really believe, really want to fight. Those are the people who will fight to get into office and will actually do something once they get there.
Respect the hustle. You've got to say, right, if in the difference between AOC and Joe Crowley, she had hustle and he
had a little hustle of his own going on, but yes.
Well, his little hustle was to become speaker. And
right.
He was working in D.C. And
exactly.
He's, by all accounts, he's a great guy. But he did not see this going on. No. At Move On, in
the district, he showed no hustle.
That's right. So at Move On, we endorse based on votes of our members. We don't. It's not an internal committee that reviews candidates. We look for races where our members might have a strong feeling. Then we do a member vote. And our members voted like 3/4 to endorse AOC. And that only happens when there's something going on, beyond the campaign consultants. That's actual grassroots energy that she and her campaign generated by building an army of volunteers, by going, door after door after door after door. It's like 130,000 doors, something like that in her district that her campaign knocked. That shows that there's really something moving. And that is happening in races across the country, often races that are outside of the kind of Washington radar. And it's not like the only people who can get that kind of energy are it's so far from the truth that as the DCCC would imagine, the only people who can get that kind of energy are those who are splitting the difference with Republicans. It's not like that at all. It's actually the people who are inspiring genuine passion, who have the hustle, and who are embracing ideas that make people want to fight because they know how it would affect their lives.
MoveOn.org. If you're not a member, why not? It should be. Sign up. And Ben Wikler is our Washington director here. So I want to get to some of these some of these important races that you're involved in. But you mentioned a lot about the energy and the turnout and everything. Frank Bruni had a great column, I thought, pretty basic in the Sunday New York Times. The headline is, "Disgusted with Donald Trump? Do this." And always talking about do this. What do this means, get out there and work your butt off, right?
Yes. Yep.
If you're not registered, of course, register to vote. But go out and register some other people. Help voter registration drives. Help some candidates that you believe in. Work your butt off between now and make sure everybody you know is out and voted. And so much of it does depend on this energy level, voter turnout, right? I mean, and which classically in midterms, the people who tend to vote in midterms are older, whiter voters, right, who are more likely to vote. But And that's got to change.
That's
right?
got to change. And it will change because the other through line for
changing,
midterms is that it's the people who are not in the president's party who tend to have the most energy.
Yeah.
And we saw that in the Obama years. But frankly, 2006, Democratic takeover of the House, that was a year the electorate, I'm pretty sure it was not older and whiter than the electorate that elected George W. Bush for a second term in 2004. Right. So
it's because by that time, people had had enough, right?
Exactly. And I think we've had about 20 years too much of Donald Trump in his first year and a half already.
Yes.
So this is a really important point. There's a new collaboration between Swing Left, Move On, Indivisible, a slew of other groups around a unified plan to massively get out the vote for the midterms that is working with an organization called Mobilize that basically creates a public registry of volunteer shifts with campaigns. So even though lots of these groups are uncoordinated with campaigns, we can recruit people to sign up for volunteer shifts directly with campaigns without coordinating with the campaigns themselves. And if you want to plug in to the place where your time will be most strategically used at the moments when it's most important, go to thelastweekend.org. Thelastweekend.org is this new giant collaborative to get everybody plugged in. And the reason for it's called The Last Weekend is that studies have found that when you talk to a voter, the effect of it is real, but it fades over time.
Yes.
And so the most important time is to set aside the last 4 days of the race and make sure you are just spending every waking second talking to voters and urging them to vote for the candidates you care about. Now, thelastweekend.org, if you sign up there, you'll also hear about opportunities to help out in the time before then, which definitely helps. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But I want you to, right now, take out your phone, mark your calendar for the last 4 days, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday of the election, and plan to spend those fighting to stop this Republican ongoing atrocity from continuing.
And so this is nationwide.
Nationwide, that's right.
Thelastweekend.org.
Yes.
We'll put that out there. Yeah, we'll tweet
that.
Now,
and all the different organizations you mentioned. And by the way, every time I go through the list, I'm afraid I forget one. But it's so, to me, it's so exciting. The enthusiasm, the energy that's being generated, it's all grassroots up too, right?
Absolutely.
It's not coming from the DNC. It's not coming from the DCCC. It's groups like MoveOn.org, like you mentioned, Swing Left, Indivisible, Our Revolution, Run for Something, Emily's List. I can't remember them all, right? Some are brand new. Some have been around for a while, like Move On and Emily's List.
And some are local groups. In state after state, there are statewide, even citywide, or even neighborhood-based organizations that have just huge amounts of volunteer energy, people going to meetings every week. Often at the grassroots level, people are signed up for the lists of all these different groups, and they'll come to their meeting and say, I got this email from Move On, I got this email from Our Revolution. What should we do our protest on this week?
Right.
And that's exactly how it should work. There's no turf here. We are all in the same movement trying to build a blue wave.
Peter, there's one group that we were actually hoping to get in, and I don't think we have yet, but that they were like, if you live in a safe Democratic district, and your guy...
Sister district. Was it Sister District?
That's it. Sister District. Right.
Yes.
Which I love that concept. They'll say, well, if you're in a safe Democratic, they may not need you there, but we could use you. Boom.
Absolutely.
Here's one close to you where you could drive in and jump in.
Yeah, and frankly, most people live within driving distance of a swing house district.
Yeah.
There are a lot of swing house districts this cycle.
Right.
Go to sisterdistrict.org and figure out where it is and plan to spend some time there. You're not an outsider. You are a neighbor.
Yeah.
And it's time to go and talk to people.
So what are you asking people to do? Right now, just chime in anything they can do, but particularly sign up again for thelastweekend.org.
That's right. So that's one thing. A second thing is there's going to be a National Day of Action on Brett Kavanaugh on August 26th. That's organized with Move On, working very closely with NARAL, which had the idea for the actions, leading the way in that fight, and then a coalition of tons of other groups. So if you go to NARAL or Move On, you'll be able to sign up for our list. You'll get more information about that day of action. It's important that we show that there's grassroots energy on this court fight on our side.
Right.
Democrats have to see that just as Republicans do. And there are cracks in the Republican dam right now that it is worth continuing that fight. So that's another immediate thing you can do.
On the point of Brett Kavanaugh, the Sarah Huckabee Sanders started the briefing yesterday by attacking the Democrats who refused to meet with with Brett Kavanaugh. Yeah, how ironic. Here she is.
For members of the opposing party to demand answers to questions and yet refuse to even meet with a qualified Supreme Court nominee is unprecedented.
Does she really think we forget Merrick Garland? Nobody would meet with him. They wouldn't hold a hearing. They wouldn't meet with him. Chuck Grassley never met with him.
Her argument is without Merrick.
Yeah.
What a disaster.
It is.
I mean, in fairness, her job is to go out there and,
I know, but sometimes
with a poker face, say the most ridiculous things.
Yeah.
But it's ridiculous. And
it is. It's just like yesterday, Donald Trump, he didn't have a hat on, but here he is selling MAGA hats, right, or wearing MAGA hats, made in China, who stands up and makes a big speech about, we have to buy America, and it matters to me where things are made. No, it doesn't.
It matters to him where things are made. When I'm selling it, it matters that it's in the lowest possible wage place in the world.
Right.
When you're buying it,
yes,
make sure it has my name printed on it.
Yeah.
Those are his rules.
And the same rule applies for Ivanka's jewelry. Right. Yeah, no, it's just...
Yeah.
So,
no, I mean,
what are some of the important races that we should be looking at? Some of the ones that maybe the national media is not looking at. Where's MoveOn.org active?
Boy, so if you go to candidates.moveon.org, you're going to see the list of endorsed candidates so far. There's more endorsements coming online, a lot right now. Our strategy for the midterms is sort of threefold. The first, biggest, central, most important thing is to take the House. And it's so vital to stay focused on that as the top thing. I think some people give me the shivers by having a little bit of a false sense of complacency that will definitely happen. And there's nothing guaranteed about any of this.
By the way, amen, amen, amen. You cannot just assume that that's going to be automatic.
I hope 2016 was enough of a wake-up call for folks, but
let's hope.
It is so easy to read polls and think everything's going to be fine. There's absolutely nothing guaranteed. For
what there is the possibility, and a good possibility, that Democrats could take back the House this year, but it's not going to happen unless we make it happen.
That is absolutely the case.
Yeah.
So that's number one. The second thing is, and at MoveOn, we're endorsing we're aiming to endorse ultimately 100 House candidates across the country, which is
we need to win 24.
We need to win
23.
23. That's right.
Yeah.
If we get part of our theory for this is looking at what's happened in the special elections. You just never know where you have a shot at winning. And so casting a really wide net, making sure not spreading your energy thin, but making sure that people locally in all these districts know that there's a way to plug into a race that has a potential shot. That's our best shot at being able to pick up districts where something erupts late in the cycle, or the wind suddenly shifts in our direction. You want to squeeze everything you can out of a moment like this. So 100 House districts we're focused on across the country. Then we're doing something new for us: 100 state and local candidates. So that's everyone, gubernatorial candidates like Stacey Abrams, to attorney general candidates, lieutenant governor candidates, all state legislative candidates. Exciting people who often bring, a fresh face or voice to the fight, especially trying to build a slate of candidates that reflects the extraordinary diversity and and kind of youthfulness and energy of the Democratic field and the progressive movement. And then there's the Senate. That's the third thing. Now the Senate, statistically, the argument is it's very hard for Democrats to hold on to the Senate. But I think to win the Senate.
To win, right.
I think, first of all, it's worth a shot. And secondly, every vote matters in the Senate. The confirmation battles are coming down to, in some cases, a one-vote margin. And so if we lose 2 seats, it is much worse than if we lose 1 seat. If we have a majority with 2 seats, it is vastly better than having a majority of 1 seat. Every single Senate race really matters. And we're particularly focused on races like Tammy Baldwin's in Wisconsin. Tammy is the subject of the biggest dark money spend in the country. They've already spent $10 million running attack ads just to beat her up, because she's a threat to the Koch brothers. And the Koch brothers have this machine in Wisconsin they've used to take the governorship. They've used to rip up the labor protections. So much of what made the state great.
Scott Walker.
They made Scott Walker. He is their puppet. And they want to take Tammy Baldwin out. And we have to show them that that is not going to happen. So she's an example. Sherrod Brown's race. We're throwing down, especially in these races in critical states where there are strong progressives that are being targeted by the right to take them out. And make no mistake, when the right is going after Tammy Baldwin or Sherrod Brown, they're doing it because they want to win those states in 2020 as well. And it's what happens at the top of the ticket in races like Wisconsin's will affect what happens at the state legislature as well with the governor's race, and that affects redistricting, which in some ways is the longest term fallout of this election. What happens in state legislatures now determines control of the House for the next decade.
Yeah, right. That's why I was really pleased to hear you say that you're endorsing 100 candidates in state legislative and state constitutional offices because it is so important. The governorships there and the control of the state legislature are going to decide who draws the lines the next time around.
That's
you
right.
just pointed out.
Democrats took their eye off the ball off of this for so long. I remember in high school hearing about the Christian right's kind of totally bottom-up electoral strategy where they were going after school board seats, city council seats, building this deep bench of elected officials who could then move up through the ranks. Those people then get to state legislatures. They join ALEC. They start introducing, stand your ground bills and pro-fracking bills and bills to, all these corporate finance bills to preempt municipal Wi-Fi, all this kind of stuff. And they make their bones with ALEC, and then they get elected to Congress, and they move on up the chain. And on our side, we've had this kind of fascination, this mesmerization with presidential politics. And as we are seeing, it matters who's president, but you have to start right at the ground level and build up because it can't just be, there's no one person who can make all the difference we need. And all the other offices that we're talking about, especially state legislatures, create the kind of foundation for being able to build the kind of progressive country that we all want to live in.
So the people can find out about this list of candidates that you either already have or will be endorsing at moveon.org?
Yeah, candidates.moveon.org. We have a special page. You can see their photos and their bios. Click through to more information about them. And every week we're doing more endorsement votes and announcing additional folks that we've endorsed. One other thing I'll note. Mostly we're focused on candidates, but this year we're also getting involved with supporting the Florida Second Chances Initiative, which is a ballot initiative in Florida that restores the right to vote to 1.4 million ex-offenders there.
Whoa. Yeah, that's very, very important.
It's so important. It is the right thing to do.
Sure.
And it's also
Terry McAuliffe, governor, was able to do that in Virginia.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it makes a big difference.
Right. They I heard he tell that story. In Virginia, it was like 600 or 800, whatever it was. Or I forget how many.
Yeah.
And he did it, and the judge ruled against it and said, because you can't do a mass pardon like that or something, like or restoration or whatever. And so he said, oh, but I could do them one at a time? He said, yeah. He said, okay, bring them to me. And he sat there and he signed every last one of them one at a time. That's how he got around it.
No way.
Yeah.
I had no idea. That's amazing. That's awesome.
It's a great story. I'll show you. I'm going to do it. I'll do it. Yeah.
So
in Florida,
for the pen vendor.
Yeah. Florida, it's an initiative.
Yes, it's a ballot initiative. And if you're in Florida right now, there's phone banking this weekend. I think across the country, you can call voters in Florida to get them plugged into this. If you Google Florida Second Chances, you can find it.
I find this is so exciting. To me, I haven't seen, a little older than you are, but I haven't seen this kind of excitement, particularly among young people, grassroots activity since the anti-Vietnam War protests. I mean, it's happening. It's popping up all over the country. I saw the number the other day. I forget it now. But there is twice as many candidates running this year as we've ever as in the last time there was a blue wave, I think 2006.
Yeah.
But this year there are twice as many candidates running.
Yeah.
It's because part of this enthusiasm and energy is people saying, no, I could run for this. Or
absolutely.
Yeah. And in districts where we've never even had a Democrat on the ballot before.
That's right. Yeah.
There are people running for these seats.
And those people are not just random candidates. They're often coming out of these groups. They're coming out of communities of people that are working and trying to make a difference. You talk to candidates who say...
back to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's a classic example. Never ran for office before. She's a volunteer, or she's a waitress volunteering for Bernie Sanders. Yeah. And she gets the bug.
Brand new Congress and Justice Democrats sit down with her, say, you should run. And what's happening right now that you can see is that these candidates are running for office as part of a movement, which is frankly much more powerful than just building your own personal machine. When you run as part of a movement, you're accountable to the movement. You have allies that you can work with to try to whip votes of other legislators. This is the beginning of one of those moments where not only can you win a lot of offices, but you can actually pass bills because people are running for office and they're standing for something. And that's when you actually change people's lives. And ultimately, that's what builds the kind of political constituency for progressive policies that we need.
I don't want to give him all the credit for it, but I've had this conversation so many times early on with Senator Sanders, and from the beginning, he told me and everybody else what he really was interested in more than running for president was building a movement.
Absolutely.
Again, he's had played a big role in this movement that is certainly out there today.
The first time I met Bernie Sanders was, the early 2000s, maybe it was the 90s, at Fighting Bob Fest in Wisconsin. Fighting Bob LaFollette was the founder of the progressive movement. He was this great senator. Yeah. He fought for a slew of progressive politics before it was cool in the early 20th century. Yeah. And there's an annual festival celebrating him in Wisconsin called Fighting Bob Fest. And Bernie Sanders used to fly out to Wisconsin, go to rural Wisconsin, and speak at Fighting Bob Fest because he believes in building a progressive movement. And had nothing to do with
Robert LaFollette is considered the father of the progressive.
Absolutely. There's a big bust of him in the Wisconsin State Capitol. Still, Scott Walker can't take it away. Fighting Bob Fest. Bernie Sanders, he wasn't thinking about running for president. He wasn't thinking about getting votes in Wisconsin. He was just wanted to help, support local progressive movement building. So that's when I met him. I had no idea who he was at the time, and that he's been doing that for his whole life. And part of what building a movement means is creating channels and ways for people to contribute to something bigger than themselves, bigger than their own election, and it can wind up helping build this kind of electoral force we need this year.
So what's possible and what's not? For that, we look at the polls, and to help us through some of the polls today, we're going to be joined. Ben Steer, staying here as a friend of Bill, will be joined by Ariel Edwards-Levy from HuffPost coming up next year on the Bill Press Show.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Sam Pizzigati, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.